Hey everyone, it's Erin with Counter Read. I'm joined by Brandon, also of Counter Read, and we are here to recap a Husker win, 28-14 over Louisiana Tech. Brandon, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. I'm in terrible lighting because I'm in a hallway of the press box. So apologies to everyone who's like, you've got very harsh lighting because that's absolutely true. Uh, the press box is definitely still in teardown mode because I think, the rain delay threw a lot of people for a loop more so than we would usually expect. But here we are. We have made it to the end of the game. The rain has thankfully and lightning have moved out of the area, and we have a Husker win to talk about. So I have all of the game notes right in front of me. But before we dive into anything specific, Brandon, I'm just curious what your overall just takeaways from this game were, at least just high level right off the bat.
Yeah. Um, so the line on this game was Nebraska minus 21. They won by 14. So if you look at things that way, and I don't all of the time, you can say, they underachieved by about a touchdown. Um, it was a little bit sleepier, closer, slower in a lot of ways game than I kind of expected. Like I did not think that Nebraska was going to run away with this at all. But Louisiana Tech had a little bit more success offensively, not a ton. The defense still played well, to be clear, but a little more success than I expected. Nebraska, which is kind of becoming a thing with them, I mean, it was tied at halftime. It needed the second half to pull away. So that gets a little bit interesting. Like in a lot of ways, it was a pretty true result. I feel like for where Nebraska's at right now, when I compare it to last week, like I feel like they checked all the boxes against Northern Illinois. Here, I feel like maybe a few were left unchecked. What do you think?
That's where I'm at. And I will give him credit. Matt Rule did talk about some of the penalties post game, and he was specifically asked if he thought some of them were, lack of discipline or if maybe they were just bad calls. And he said, once I watch the film, I might feel differently. But he said a couple of them he looked up and he thought that they had played it really well. And so it could have just been bad calls. Now, there were a lot of penalties in this game on both sides. To me, like from a perspective of being in person, it felt like a really sleepy game. The crowd was sleepy. The teams kind of just felt a little sleepy. And I don't know how that's going to make a lot of people feel hearing me say that, because especially as you're getting ready for Michigan to come to town, I don't know. It just didn't feel like there's a whole lot of like, I don't even want to say enthusiasm because that's making an assumption that people didn't feel like excited about this
Yeah.
game. But for some reason, the energy in the stadium was just really, really sleepy. It was the word I kept kind of going back to. And when you look at things, I mean, Heinrich Harburg had a good day rushing. Anthony Grant had a good day rushing. I think overall, Nebraska has shown it can run the ball, which is good if you're a run the ball fan. Where things get a little bit more dicey is the fact that Nebraska only threw for 107 total yards. That was one thing where it's like, yeah, I know running the ball is key, but you also need to be able to pass just a little bit more efficiently than that. And again, it goes back to what we've talked to week in and week out. I just don't know if Nebraska has that consistent skill player that it's had in the past. You don't have the Trey Palmer that you can kind of rely on, the Jack. I was going to say Jack Stoll, and that's a throwback. There's a number of tight ends and a number of receivers that you at least had one or two where you could say, okay, reasonably the quarterback can get to this one person. Billy Kemp is doing his best. Fedoni is finding
Yeah.
his way, but it's just not consistent enough. And I think for me, that's an issue right now that they still have yet to address.
Yeah, I would agree wholeheartedly. Here's the way I've taken to thinking about that is in a hypothetical game, which would never happen, but is worth it for kind of a thought experiment where, okay, Michigan comes to town next week and the wizard of college football says you can't run the ball. It's not allowed. You have to throw it. What sort of spot would Nebraska be in? They'd be in a lot of trouble, in my view. So like I understand like run the ball, like I understand kind of the resonance it has with Nebraska's history, with its region, all of that stuff. Like it's all important and good. And it's clearly how they want to play. You have to be able to throw the ball to like some base level of competency. And so far that's been a struggle. It's not that it's been bad. Like they'll hit some plays occasionally, but it's just not consistent enough. Like in a theoretical game where you're not allowed to run the football, Nebraska would be in real trouble. And that's
And
and
that
that's where
and
they're
that
at.
has been the case no matter who the quarterback is. Like to be clear
It
too, is both Heinrich and Jeff Sims have run into this very same issue. And even in the limited amount we've seen Chuba Purdy, it's pretty much the same thing. They're having a really hard time finding consistent play in the pass game, and therefore you're unable to stretch the defense out a little bit to make your run game even more efficient than it can be. Because I mean, 312 yards is great. You're not going to maybe see that against a number of Big Ten teams, and then that starts to get dicier.
No, and that's a really good point. Like it's been through multiple quarterbacks. Like I'm sure we'll have a big quarterback discussion this week as it goes on going into the Michigan game. Like Nebraska's only got Big Ten games left. And the fact of the matter is like for a couple of games now, Nebraska's run game has looked fairly mediocre in the first half and then taken off in the second half. And that's great and that's good. And that can be a little bit of a sort of boost to the idea of just keep running it. Those runs will become longer if you stick to it. And I get that, but you're not going to wear Michigan down the way that you can Louisiana Tech or Northern Illinois. Um, you know, against the better teams in the Big Ten, that's going to be hard. And Nebraska through 4 games has been, I'm not trying to be negative here. Like they're 2-2. Like they kind of have done the best they could with the start that they had. Um, but it's going to be the question for them going forward in Big Ten play because like the book on them is pretty easy. Like yeah, you play man against the wide receivers. You devote as many people to the run game as you can beyond that, and make them prove that they can do it that way. And I guess that's the big thing that comes to me from this game is like it didn't do anything more in terms of proving that Nebraska can just beat you in terms of throwing the football.
I will say, before this game began, I made a joke with a number of media members where I said, a little bit of what's happening with Nebraska right now is reminding me a bit of 2009 and 2010, where Bo Pelini was looking at having a fairly good defense, but the offense was questionable at times. And so what did he do is what he did is he allowed Alex Henry to have these plays available to him where if he saw the opportunity. Now you see that quite a bit more with punters, where when the opportunity presents themselves, that you could potentially keep the ball, run the ball, do something with it. And I went and looked it up. It was a 2010 game against Oklahoma State where Alex Henry, I think for a period of time, had like the team's leading rush yards because he had taken a fake, or he'd taken the punt, he faked the play and then ended up rushing for like 20 some yards or whatever. And I made a joke before the game where I was like, they should do that. I didn't think they would do that with Timmy Bleekrode. But sure enough, it was great to see him get involved. He was clearly very excited about the opportunity to make an impact on the game, and that did have an impact. Matt Rule said that is something they've been working on for a couple of weeks. And in fact, if you had seen a couple of plays go differently against Colorado, you would have seen it debut then. So I think a little bit of this is you're going to have to get clever. And I don't think you're going to win every single Big Ten game by being tricky and being clever, but you might be able to set yourself up a little bit. You might just be able to set your offense up a little bit more if you get clever in some of those other ways. And that's what I'm kind of now starting to think, like, while I made the joke pregame, hey, maybe you start having your kicker / punter fake it a little bit more often or do something. they might have to just get a little bit tricky here because this offense, like looking at it, and again, I agree with you. I don't want to come across as negative in any ways. I'm just saying, looking at the schedule ahead, I'm concerned because I just don't think we're seeing enough to think that Nebraska is going to be able to be consistent when you have Michigan, Michigan State, Wisconsin, a number of really like, I know Wisconsin is a little bit down this year too, but these are still Big Ten teams that are known for being tough up front. That's what concerns me, is them just being bulldozers to Nebraska's offensive line, and then not only taking away some of that run game, but then also taking away its pass game because there just isn't a strong enough one yet.
Yeah, I think bottom line, Nebraska is right now at a point where all it can really execute is Iowa, Iowa, Iowa ball, for lack of a better term. And I don't mean that as a slight to
Iowa
Iowa
ball.
at all. Like, but we've seen it up close, just as people who cover and follow Nebraska, right? Like, defensively, you're going to be super, super tough. Offensively, you're going to do the like in some ways the bare minimum, in some ways even less than that. And we've seen the Hawkeyes win 9-10 games doing it that way. I don't think that's in the cards for Nebraska, but that's really where they're at as we kind of turn the page to Michigan. Like, offensively, I don't think there's any major sea change coming. The quarterback position will be a little bit interesting to watch as we go forward, but like, it's just like your defense is going to have to win you some games. And this game was kind of interesting in that Nebraska didn't have any sacks, which they'd been very good at getting, which is one of those things that, like, if you come in and you're Sonny Cumby and you're a huge underdog as Louisiana Tech, you can scheme around that a little bit. But there was that piece of it. Otherwise, Nebraska's defensive numbers all looked pretty good. They're still not getting a ton of takeaways, which, like, if you're going to play Iowa ball and survive, you need to have a lot of takeaways. So I mean, I think most of this Louisiana Tech game was a win. It got Nebraska back to 500. It also kind of clearly showed me, I think, where they're at. And where they're at, I think, is where most people would realistically assess them. Like, they're going to struggle to move the football. Defensively, like, they're going to be in position. They're going to be sound. They're going to tackle well. Are they going to force a bunch of turnovers and lead to / produce points on their own? We haven't seen that yet. So what do you do? I mean, it's not the strongest. It's not the strongest hand in the world to be playing from, but in my mind, it's like as strong as it could be at this point. I really do believe that.
So one thing with the defense that's important to note is Luke Reimer was in street clothes coming out of the locker room after halftime. Matt Rule did not have an update on that. He said, well, he'll have to provide more later. He wasn't sure. There are some other little pieces of a couple of little injury notes here and there where he wasn't overly concerned, at least not in like the short term, right after the game. But the one that was the most probably notable is Luke Reimer, especially when you have a defense that is playing fairly solid right now. You definitely don't want to lose anyone. But I think for myself, I said this the first week following the Minnesota loss, that in 2022, I remember thinking after the loss to Northwestern that Nebraska had shown us who it was at that point. And that sounded a little like you're getting ahead of yourself. It's only one game, but it's like at that point we had a pretty good resume of information to really kind of work from there. This is one where I think, like you just said, now 4 games in, I have a pretty good understanding now of who this team is. And I think this team is a solid defense, not to just completely reiterate what you said, but I think to sum it up, it's a pretty good defense. It's a strong enough defense that can keep you in games and can help wear down another team. It's a questionable offense that's going to hit and miss, and that's probably the biggest concerning point in like on special teams. You're gonna have to play pretty consistently, and like there's consistent pieces of special teams like Brian Buccini, where he has always been fairly strong. And like, again, I felt like against Louisiana Tech, he was fine. Like, he wasn't bad. He was just kind of, I would say, more average than he has been in the past. And so it's like, there's pieces where if the offense is going to struggle, these other areas cannot. And so those are the questions I have now with this team, where I'm like, I think this team is, I think maybe where I'm coming from, and now to bring this full circle, Matt Rule said something where he's like, a lot of his players, or a lot of players and people, will come to him and be like, can we beat this team? And he's like, I don't want you to worry about the opponent so much as just showing up and practicing to the best of your ability, putting the work in, and then we'll show up on game day and see what happens. And I know that that doesn't probably provide a lot of comfort, that your head coach is saying, we'll see what happens. I don't think he means it like that. He's meaning it like, if you put in the work and we can scheme really, really strongly against this team, it might just pan out in our favor. I think right now, though, that even he understands there's challenges that this team is going to have to overcome to get those wins, and it's not going to come easy. And I don't think that that's negative. I think that's just the reality of it. But I do think if you are a fan looking for hope, there is some glimmers of what this team can be in time. It's just not there today. And that's the piece where we could be looking at Jeff Sims starting again next week, maybe not. Is there a quarterback competition? Is there not? I personally think by them putting Chuba in at the end, that maybe says a little bit more, although they said that Heinrich was maybe cramping up a little bit. So that did change a little bit of my thinking. But when I saw Chuba go in, I'm like, do you want Chuba in if like Heinrich's going to be your future starter, or do you want him to have the time? So I don't know. There's basically, I think at this point, what this team is a bit of a question mark. And I don't say that to be negative, but it just is what it is. This is a question mark team that, I wouldn't be surprised if it doesn't knock a win off of somebody unexpected through the end of this season. I just can't guarantee you who that is.
Yeah, no, I think that's really fair. Like, you know, fact is they gave up 13 points to Minnesota, 11 points to Northern Illinois, and 14 points today. So Colorado, I think, scored 36. And that game kind of got away from you in the second half a little bit. 13, 11, 14, like that's enough defensively to win you a bunch of games if you have an offense who is scoring more than that, which sounds like and realistically is like a really low number. You look at this game with Nebraska in particular, had 2 touchdowns called off the board, and I know that Louisiana Tech had a kickoff return taken away essentially by penalty, but 2 touchdowns called off the board by wide receiver holding penalties. It's things like that that are going to define the remaining 8 games for Nebraska. That plus special teams, because special teams, like having a second kickoff out of bounds this week, for the second straight week, like they just don't have the margin for that sort of stuff. And they need offensively, like, okay, maybe one of your touchdowns gets called back, but you can't have both of them. Like that's what's going to take to, well, it's gonna take more than that to beat a Michigan, but that's what it's going to take to beat an Illinois, and a Purdue, and maybe an Iowa and a Wisconsin and the other West Division teams. Is like you just got to be like really clean. Like it's okay if your offense is limited, like and they definitely know that at this point. If you know that and can plan around it, it comes down to the execution piece of this. And Nebraska's execution today was okay. It wasn't great. It wasn't terrible. It was fine. And that's why it looked like, I think, a 28-14 game.
Yeah, I would say it's gonna be interesting. I think I'm really looking forward to the matchup with Michigan for a number of reasons, just because I do think it will be interesting to see how Nebraska responds. I'm actually really intrigued to see Nebraska's defense against Michigan. I know that I know that we want to see a complete game and everything else, but I am interested to see the defense go up against Michigan. Overall, again, I think there's some glimmers here where you can take little pieces. It's just not complete yet. It is year one of a coach, so there's some grace to be had in that. I am curious for people that are still watching this, because at this point I'm just staring at the stat sheet trying to make things jump out to me that like I haven't already stared at for the last 30, 40, 50 minutes. But if you have any thoughts like on what your takeaways were, if you feel that we are on base, off base, whatever the case is, the one beautiful thing about this is we can all have varying levels of opinions and thoughts, and none of them are inherently good, bad, or anything else. They're just opinions. And yeah, so if you have any thoughts, feel free to chime in the comments. You can also tweet at us and let us know what you think. I'm at Erin Sorensen. You're at Brandon L. Vogel on Twitter.
Yes.
I got it. If you didn't see, he gave me a thumbs up. So I am still doing well considering this day and game has taken a lot longer than I thought it would. But again, go ahead and check out counterread.com. You can always subscribe there. Make sure that we are getting our newsletters. We'll be back on Monday to start a new week as you get ready for Michigan and everything to come. You can comment here on this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Brandon, before I let you go, any final quick thoughts for the evening?
Just one, like this game kind of drove home for me. Like this is how it's going to be. Like there's a lot to be encouraged by defensively. There are clear limitations offensively, and that's going to be the interplay. Like that's what it's going to be. And beating Michigan's going to aid Michigan, but also the Michigan coming up next week. It would take an extraordinary effort. But you look beyond that against an Illinois, a Northwestern, a Purdue, like that's going to come down to how well Nebraska executes its plan. So I think my big takeaway from this is like we're 4 games in, so we're a third of the way through the season. Offensively, I'm kind of like, this is just what it is. Like there's some limitations here that we're all seeing, and they're very, very real. That said, I think Nebraska is playing about as well as it can, given some of those real limitations. And that can be a tough thing to digest, but that's where I'm at. And if you think about it from a coaching perspective, I think that's your job. That's your job every day as a coach, is like, how can I get us to play as well as we possibly can? And you're hoping to make things better for the future. So yeah, that's where I'm at.
And to that, I do actually think I agree. I think that's the mentality of Matt Rule at this point, is he wants his players to show up every week, and he just wants them to practice as hard as they can and win the rep for that particular game and that particular opponent, and stop worrying so much about what is to come or has happened already. And so I do find the whole thing to be very, very it's interesting to watch the psychology of people in action. So with that said, we have taken enough of your time for the evening, or if you're watching this on Sunday, that's great too. But again, head to counterread.com, go ahead and subscribe. Be sure to just check things out, because we do have a great week of upcoming things. In fact, a lot of really exciting stuff to come. Just be sure to subscribe to Counter Read. I promise you, if you have questions, comments, anything else, leave them below. Brandon, thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate it as well.
I'm going to go stare at these now for like another hour, because this thing is confusing, because just this game was something else. All right, everyone, we will talk to you later.